And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Imagine a huge factory in Seattle, where machines have been rumbling for decades, where every bolt and rivet symbolized the strength of American industry, now empty. A cold wind blows through the former assembly hall, where planes were once built for presidents, soldiers, diplomats, and ordinary Americans. The Boeing factory, once the pride of the United States, is closed. And not just temporarily. There were no loud announcements or press conferences. They simply turned off the lights and sent the workers home. Production was quietly and quickly moved to Mexico.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Why? The official version is cost-cutting. The unofficial version is systemic failure. The same system that promised to bring back jobs and make America great again. And while Washington talks about patriotism, wings for new Boeings are already being assembled in Monterey. Yes, now planes with the American flag will be born where taxes are lower, wages are lower, and there is no made in the USA.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
But this is not just a factory closure. This is not just a decision by the board of directors. This is a betrayal of a symbol. Boeing is not just a company. It was a beacon of industrial America. These were the planes that brought people home from war. These were the airliners on which millions of Americans crossed the ocean for the first time. It was American space, pride in technology, precision, and reliability. And now that pride has quietly slipped across the border.
Is that ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10%, when you collect it, is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
What happened? Why did the government, which promised to bring back jobs, allow one of the country's most important companies to close its production facilities in its homeland? Why are engineers with 20 years of experience, who have never taken sick leave, now standing in line for unemployment benefits? Why did the US impose tariffs on aluminum and steel to protect factories, only to destroy supply chains, stifle its own manufacturers, and drive a legendary company out of the country?
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
And most importantly, if even Boeing leaves the US, what will be left? Cars are no longer made in Detroit. Steel is no longer smelted in Pittsburgh. Clothes are no longer sewn in Carolina. And now planes are no longer made in Seattle. All that remains is silence in the workshops and pain in the voice of the engineer who once proudly told his son, "I built this plane, and it will carry doctors, scientists, and heroes around the world."
But I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Today, we will tell you how Boeing went from being a symbol of the nation to a symptom of a global crisis, why Canada is winning where America is losing, and what awaits the country if all that remains of its symbols are logos. This story is not about airplanes. It is a story about how faith in a country that once promised that honest work was the path to a decent life is crumbling.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
When a Boeing security guard in Seattle arrived for his shift on the morning of January 8, 2025, he found the factory where he had worked for 17 years plunged into silence. For the first time in his career, there was no sound, no crane cries, no hammering, no smell of machine oil. The security guard, named Carl, later told a local TV station, "I knew right away that something had ended. Not just the workday, but an entire era." By lunchtime, it was clear from internal sources that the plant was closed. No press release, no words of support, no compensation for the thousands of families who depended on this factory. Boeing simply took the people out, turned off the lights, and closed the gates. In the morning, they were building parts for military aircraft and commercial airliners. In the evening, only dust remained.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
But in 2017, everything looked different. The then head of the White House, standing in front of the gleaming fuselage of a Boeing 787 in South Carolina, proclaimed loudly, "We will bring back the jobs. We will start manufacturing again." Boeing is proof that America is building again. The crowd applauded. The workers cried with pride. It was like a promise of a new industrial spring. But 8 years later, there is only gloom, emptiness, and abandoned machines. Instead of revival, there is a new exodus. Instead of flags, there are calculators. Instead of a future, there is Excel spreadsheets with savings figures.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
Boeing, the largest aircraft manufacturer in the US, has begun to move production to Mexico. Fuselage parts, wings, electronics blocks, all of this is now assembled in Monterrey. Where beer and textiles were once produced, aircraft are now being built for the US Army and the President. According to a leaked report, up to 12,000 people will work at the new complex, including engineers who have been retrained under a Mexican government program. Salaries there are about 1/6 of those in the US. Taxes are half as much, and logistics have been simplified thanks to the new North American Aviation Zone, signed in December 2024, which most Americans have never even heard of.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
When CNBC asked Boeing's CEO if this was contrary to American interests, he replied, "Volatility is the new normal. We don't choose between countries. We choose between survival and bankruptcy." Loud. But too honest, because in reality it wasn't a choice, it was a betrayal. After all, Boeing isn't just a business. It's the planes that brought soldiers home. It's the Ford of the air, the embodiment of power, technology, and hope. It is a company whose name was written on the wings of dreams. When Boeing flies away from America, It is not just manufacturing that leaves a part of the identity leaves. And if assembly is happening in the South, then smiles are happening in the North. Canada, oddly enough, has come out on top. While the US is handing out tariffs, Canada is handing out contracts. While Washington raises taxes, Ottawa offers incentives and subsidies. While the White House builds barriers, Canada builds bridges. One of Boeing's largest suppliers, the French company AS Tech, has already signed an agreement to move its logistics hub from Chicago to Toronto. And if sources are to be believed, behind the scenes, negotiations are underway to move one of Boeing's research centers to Vancouver. For the American economy, this sounds almost like treason. But why did everything collapse right now? The answer lies partly in the numbers. In 2024, Boeing spent more than $3.2 billion on aluminum and steel alone, 27% more than in 2022. The reason is tariffs introduced to protect domestic production. But in fact, these measures have made domestic materials uncompetitive. Small suppliers began to go bankrupt, deadlines were missed, and contracts were lost. In desperation, Boeing began to optimize. First came outsourcing, then migration, then a silent exodus. Yet in 2015, more than 10,000 people worked at the Renton plant. Today, there are fewer than 2,000. Dreamliner assembly has been partially relocated. The quality control center has been downsized. The training center for engineers has been closed. Even the factory canteen, which used to serve 800 employees a day, now only operates twice a week. Local snack bars and cafes are closing, and transport routes are being cancelled. One factory and the entire ecosystem is collapsing like a house of cards. One of the technicians, Tom Sandler, told reporters, "I've been assembling wings for 25 years. I put my heart and soul into it. Now they've told me, thanks, we don't need you anymore." His wife is a nurse, but her hours have also been cut. Their son is studying to be an engineer. He may have to drop out because they can no longer afford it. "I'm not asking for wealth, just fairness," he said, and his voice echoed that of tens of thousands of others. At the same time, the US is increasing its defense budget, discussing the construction of new aircraft carriers, and signing multi-billion-dollar aid packages. And the workers who built the planes are signing up for Uber and DoorDash. One of them, James Ruth, a former chassis assembly specialist, now delivers burgers in the suburbs of Seattle. "In 2010, I was assembling planes for the Air Force. Now I'm delivering food. That's America for you." Meanwhile, the statistics are frightening. Between 2019 and 2024, Boeing's manufacturing workforce in the US will be reduced by 22%. Purchases from local contractors have fallen by 38%. More than 170 small businesses in California, Washington, and South Carolina have gone out of business. And all this against a backdrop of politicians' statements about industrial revival. It seems that words remain, but factories are disappearing. Against this backdrop, Canada has carried out its quiet offensive. No slogans, no show, just an alternative. Where the US promises, Canada delivers. Where America threatens tariffs, Canada promises support. Where the White House talks about sovereignty, Ottawa talks about the future. As a result, Canadian companies have started hiring American engineers. More than 2,000 former Boeing employees have already applied for work visas in Quebec and Ontario. When asked why, they all give the same answer. At least they respect us there. This isn't just about airplanes, it's about America losing its footing, one symbol after another. Ford, once a source of pride, now makes cars in Mexico. GE is selling off its assets. Boeing is flying away. What's next? NASA? The White House? Ironically, more and more people are saying, at least Canada has a plan. The US only has slogans. And maybe they're right when the White House announced a new package of tariffs on imported steel, aluminum, and aircraft components in the spring of 2025. The reaction from experts was muted, but panic broke out in factories and offices across the country. Large corporations that had recently been photographed with politicians against a backdrop of flags and "Made in the USA" logos began secretly looking for ways to retreat. Memos, closed meetings, chains of emails marked confidential. This is how the wave of delocalization began, which would later be referred to as the largest industrial exodus in the last 30 years. Boeing was not an exception, but a harbinger. Others followed, albeit less loudly. But it was Boeing's departure that became a symbol of the failure of a policy based on trade threats rather than strategy. Canada took a surprisingly quiet but effective position at this point. No rallies, no loud statements, just action. In March 2025, a few days before the US Congress approved additional tariffs on products from Europe and Latin America, the Canadian Ministry of Economy signed a series of new agreements with aircraft suppliers, including 2 key Boeing subcontractors. A joint training center for aircraft engineers was opened in Vancouver with the participation of European Airbus and a local technical academy. In just 6 months, Canada created not just a favorable tax zone, it formed an ecosystem that began to attract talent, expertise, and production lines. Engineers from Missouri, South Carolina, and Texas who were laid off due to downsizing increasingly submitted their resumes not to Amazon or Uber, but to Bombardier, de Havilland, or even Canadian subsidiaries of Lockheed Martin. The paradox was obvious. In an attempt to protect its domestic market from globalization, America actually pushed its flagship companies to flee. Meanwhile, Canada did not fight globalization, but adapted to it. No one introduced draconian tariffs there. Instead, they invested in technology and training, provided subsidies for automation, and launched tax holidays for new manufacturing facilities. As a result, while American politicians talked about fighting for jobs, those very jobs were already leaving for other countries. The tariff policy of 2024 to 2025 turned into economic self-destruction. In an attempt to provoke the return of manufacturing, it only increased costs for companies operating within the country. Boeing could no longer afford to buy American steel. It became 1.4 times more expensive than Chinese steel and almost twice as expensive as Mexican steel. Suppliers could not cope with the volumes. Delivery times for parts doubled. The refusal to deliver from Asia due to sanctions only exacerbated the situation. Bottlenecks formed in logistics, which brought even those lines that were not planned to be close to a standstill. According to a fictional report by North American Industrial Review, by May 2025, up to 19% of all manufacturing capacity in the U.S. aircraft industry was operating at reduced capacity, mainly due to supply disruptions and component shortages. The remaining manufacturers fell victim to another effect, the uncertainty effect. When investors and managers do not understand what tax and customs policies will look like in 6 months' time, they do not launch projects, they put them on hold. In the US, up to 48 major industrial programs have been frozen, including several experimental design initiatives in the field of civil aviation. Some have called this a cold investor period, a situation where money and manpower are available but people are simply afraid to spend them. At the same time, Canada has become an island of stability with predictable policies, social support, and investment in manufacturing and R&D. Even conservative American analysts began to openly recommend that their subscribers pay attention to the Ontario market as the future of North America's manufacturing sector. But the most alarming thing was not Boeing's departure itself, but the wave it set in motion. Logistics companies, parts suppliers, software developers, and even colleges began to regroup. Across the country, programs related to the training of aeronautical engineers and mechanics were being shut down. In Richmond, Virginia, a college stopped enrolling students in its avionics design course, one of the oldest in the country. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, internships at local Boeing plants are no longer funded. Small businesses that made parts such as seats, bolts, aluminum fragments, and composites are either switching to Chinese orders or closing down. One entrepreneur, who wished to remain anonymous, said, "I have been supplying shock absorbers for the 737 series since 2018. Today I have 4,000 units in stock. America no longer needs them." The irony is that all this is happening against a backdrop of historic levels of subsidies and promises. In early 2025, the White House announced a $68 billion industry revival program. However, 37% of this amount went to military contracts. and another 24% to administrative expenses, legal reviews, and audits. Less than half reached the companies, and even then in the form of partial tax refunds that can only be cashed in 2026. By that time, half of the recipients will most likely no longer be in the country, or they will be working for Canada Aerospace Group. Against this backdrop, there was also moral burnout. In the past, when people saw the Boeing logo, they felt proud. Today, it causes alarm. The younger generation, seeing stories in the news about breakdowns, faulty bolts, and emergency landings, perceives the brand not as the pinnacle of achievement, but as a warning. A sociological study, fictional but plausible, shows that 64% of students at technical universities in the US in 2025 do not want to pursue a career with American defense or aviation corporations. Too unstable, too corrupt, too risky. These young people are the future, and they have already turned their backs.